Here we go.
Share screen. Perfect.
Does it show the slides? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we can see them.
Okay. Cool. All right. So today's session, we usually call it a Facebook Crush Your Coding interview, where we talk about how to perform well in a coding interview. Before we start talking about coding interviews, I'll quickly introduce myself. So my name is Murtadha, and this is some of my contact information. Originally, I'm from Baghdad, and I've been working at Facebook for the last 6.5 years. I studied computer engineering. I have a bachelor's in computer engineering, and since I graduated from university, I've been at Facebook. It's been quite a while. And what some of the things I do at Facebook involve interviewing people. So over the course of the 6 years I've been at Facebook, I've interviewed hundreds of people, and interviews are sometimes pretty stressful and confusing. So this is a session that we use to try to demystify and to reveal a lot of the things about interviews that people may not know, and talk about the interview from the perspective of the interviewer and what we look for when we are interviewing candidates and evaluating them to join Facebook. So here are some of my contact information for people who would like to stay in touch after this. I'd love to hear from you. If you add me on Facebook, please introduce yourself and say how we met. I get a lot of messages or junk spam from on Facebook. So just let me know we met through this and introduce yourself so I get to know you. There's also my email, Instagram, if people want to connect other ways. So let's dive into this. And during this session too, we will, I'll ask you to participate. So I ask you to not be shy. This talk is for you. If you can ask questions through messaging them, somebody will help moderate the questions. And usually I do this in person so people can interrupt me if something is unclear. I think it's harder to interrupt with Zoom, but maybe we can try the raising your hands feature in the Zoom application if you want to ask questions. And I also ask people to participate by posing some questions to you. So if you want to share an answer, also please raise your hand, and we'll get you unmuted. Cool. So let's talk about how to prepare for interviews and what does it take to be ready. And when we think about that, we think about these three components. One of it is the process and understanding the interview process and how it works. Then it's about the material and understanding what the interview materials are and what you're expected to know. And lastly, how to communicate. So communication is key, and it's more than probably half of the interview depends on how the candidate communicates. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And most importantly, that kind of the thing that underpins all of this is your practice. And I can't stress enough how important practice is, and spending time to prepare for the material, practicing the communication, and getting familiar with the mechanics and the dynamic of the interview process. And we'll talk about all of those things in the next slides. But practicing is the most important thing you can do when you try to prepare for an interview. So let's talk about the different steps to getting a job offer. Ultimately, people are doing interviews because they want to land a job offer, and we think about 4 steps that get you to an offer. So first one is writing a good resume, and we'll talk about the how to write a great resume. Next is getting the interview, and I'll share some ideas on how to get an interview with a company. Once you get the interview, then next is how to perform well in the interview, and that's going to be the primary focus of today's session. And in the end, I'll share some tips around what happens after the interview ends. So let's get into it and talk about how to write a great resume. Before we talk about how to write a great resume, let's talk about what are the goals of a resume and why do we look at resumes. And really, the resume is intended to be something that tells your story. And you talk about your past experiences in your resume, the personal impact that you had in the projects you worked on. So when you write things in your resume, make sure it's obvious what impact you had in the projects you were working on. So if you improve the performance of an application, if you brought more users to a platform, if you made something faster or used less memory or anything, talk about that impact and what was it that you did for this project. And if there are any measurable results or metrics you can report in that summary, mention that too. I was once reviewing a resume of a student, and he was talking about how he built an automated process. Instead of, they had something in the university that people had to submit some paper forms or something, and I can't remember exactly the details of it, but it was something that took a process that was done in paper, and he turned it into an automated process done by computers. And usually the process would take a couple of days when it was done manually, but with his automation, he made it take a couple of seconds. And so when I was reviewing his resume, and it was the project, it just said automated something, and I said, "Well, what did that do? What was the impact of this?" And when he went on and told me that impact, it was fascinating. It was an impressive improvement from a few days to a few seconds. That's a huge improvement. And if you don't mention that on the resume, it's not obvious. Why was this project interesting or impactful? So making sure you report on the resume that the impact of the project you worked on is important. Showing what you're passionate about. So if you're passionate about certain tools or platforms or technologies, make sure that's standing out from your resume. If you like to learn and you have passions for artificial intelligence or virtual reality or any of the new exciting technologies that are emerging, make sure it stands out and the reader can see that from your resume and the project you mentioned on it. And finally, highlight your accomplishments, but be genuine. Don't exaggerate or inflate things or make things up. Your resume should be a true reflection of what you've done and what you worked on. And in some interviews, you will be discussing the things on your resume. So make sure you're real about it and authentic. Okay, so let's talk about what to include on the resume. A lot of a lot of people are confused sometimes. What should I put on it? And there's variance in how resumes look like across the world too. So from the perspective of a company like Facebook, we'll talk about a few things in the resume that we look for. Basic information about you, your name, your email address, contact information. You don't need to put a picture of yourself or which religion or ethnicity you are or anything like this. Just information so that people know your name and how to contact you if they need to get a hold of you. Then you can talk about your education. If you're a student still studying, then you can talk about when you're graduating and include a GPA if you can include that, and including the scale as well. Some, depending on the university, some GPAs are out of 4 or out of 10 or out of 100. So make sure you include the scale. And then projects is the most significant section of your resume where you talk about your past projects. So in there, you talk about industry experience that you've had, any internships, jobs you've held, or startups you've worked in. And then you can discuss any interesting class and personal projects you've talked about. So people say, hey, I haven't had any jobs before or haven't had any internships. What should I include on my resume? And this is where you can look at some of the projects you've done in the classroom or personal projects that you've done by yourself and including them on your resume. Again, this shows passion and it shows that you like to pursue programming and software engineering projects on your own, besides just what's required of you on the job or in the classroom. And it's totally fine to do that. And in fact, people say, oh, well, personal projects are not serious enough. And I would argue personal projects may even show more passion than classroom projects sometimes. So think about that and try to put something there that's significant and meaningful. And again, mention the impact of those projects. So you can also pursue projects in the open source world, and that's a great opportunity to participate and contribute to projects that are pretty meaningful and also give you experience, especially if you haven't had the job experience before. If you have any websites or GitHub accounts that you maintain and contribute to, then include those in your resume too. The recruiters, you're usually checking those to learn more about the candidates and their experience. And if you're a student still and you don't have a lot of industry experience, then sometimes it's good to also include your coursework. So if you've taken some interesting classes, including them on your resume could be good. And by this, I don't mean including your introduction to programming course. Most people probably will have taken a course that is introductory, and when we're not interested to see that you took an introductory course to programming, but we want to see if you took a course that is maybe focused on machine learning or artificial intelligence or something that is relevant to the position you're applying for, then it could be interesting to include that on the resume. Okay, so let's talk about next thing, and that is how to get an interview, and what are the different ways or options you have for getting an interview. So one way is getting a referral from a current employee. So in companies like Facebook, it's very common that employees are encouraged to refer people they know for a position. And usually the idea is that if the current employees are pretty competent, then they probably have people in their network that are also a good fit for working in the company. So referring people is a great way for the company to find hires and for other people to get an interview. So if you know someone, you can ask them for a referral if you have that relationship with them. But otherwise, you can also attend the talk, like here in this. If this was a talk in person, we would get a chance to mingle and get to know each other. But even though we're doing it virtually, I'll hopefully get to know some of you guys. And through these talks, usually companies discover talent and find out who are the people who are passionate, talented, and interested in positions that are open in the company. So oftentimes when we host a talk like this, there are recruiters who are usually taking resumes from people and getting to know their interests and experiences. If you participate in hackathons or coding competitions, that's also another great opportunity to be seen. Usually there are recruiters from many companies attending these events looking to hire people and bring them on for interviews. So if you have the opportunity to do that, then that's also great. If you present at a conference or seminar similar to the hackathons and coding competitions, you will be seen there, and that's a way to have people know about you and give you a chance to interview. Writing a blog is also great if there are things you're passionate about. So you will follow the new React release, and now they released a new update, and you learned something and there was a bug or something finicky about it, and you write a blog of how to use it efficiently. And so that makes you well known in the community as well. And recruiters are often looking at who is publishing, who is contributing, who's talking about the newest technologies, and they try to contact them and invite them for interviews. And finally, if none of those other things are relevant for you, then you can simply submit your resume online. But I must say that submitting a resume online is probably one of the least effective ways to get an interview, because there are millions of people submitting their resumes online for companies like Facebook every year. So it's to stand out, you probably want to consider some of the other ways I've mentioned. Okay, let's move on and talk about how to rock the interview and how to do well in the interview. I want to pause for a second and see if there have been any questions or comments in the chat. I can't see the chat view right now, so I have to switch.
So, Murtadha, so we do have one question, and it's about are machines automating filtering of resumes, or are there humans reviewing resumes?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there's probably, I should probably be careful how to answer this question, but I think there's probably some component of automation to remove things that are totally irrelevant, or applications that have a invalid resume file or something like this. So there's probably something that tries to filter out spam or totally invalid submissions. But then there is a level of people reviewing resumes. Is that the only question we have? I'm looking at the chat. Okay.
There was a question about if we are, I believe, Shalan, if you're asking if we'll be sharing the the meeting recording afterward. And I think we can, but we'll get back to you on that. And we have another question about layers of filtering resumes, different hybrids, and what if someone wants to be an intern?
Yeah, so the internships, I'll quickly go over the interview process for internships. It's very similar to how these the interview process is that we're talking about right now. So it's only going to be that you do 2 interviews usually for internships. One is, both of them will probably be on the phone. Sometimes if you're in a place where there's an office nearby, then you probably come do it in person. But often for internships, interviews are on the phone. It's depending on the region. There's different seasons for internship recruiting, and depending on which office you're looking at. I think right now with everything that's happening in the world, things are probably different. I'm not familiar with the current internship recruiting guidelines as the world is rapidly changing around us. But yeah, internships are a great way to join a company like Facebook. This is actually how I entered the company. When I was a student, I applied for an internship and I did 2 interviews, and the interviews were exactly of the kind that we're going to talk about right now. And then they will they interview you, and if you pass those 2 interviews, then you get the internship. And it's a great opportunity to learn about the company, to grow, and to also later on have the opportunity to convert to a full-time job position after graduation. So when I did my internship, I did 8 months of internship at Facebook, and at the end of those 8 months, they said, "Hey, we liked your performance during the internship, and we want you to come back and work full time." So I didn't even need to interview a second time around, and I only had to interview for the internship, and that was enough because basically the internship was the interview. When they saw how I did the job, they thought this is enough to know that we can hire this person. And so it's another great way to learn about the company and give them a chance to learn about you. There are a lot of questions coming up now in the chat, so I think we can hold some of them for later, and some of the questions might be answered as I go on. So we took a little break to answer some questions, and I think now we can continue. Hold your questions. I'm not ignoring them, and we'll return to them at the end if they have not been answered throughout the session. So let's go back and talk about the interview and how to rock the interview. So let's talk about the coding interview and why do we do them and what are the goals of a coding interview. So first thing is that we want to get a sense or a chance to see how you think and tackle hard problems. So in a job or a company like Facebook, we're constantly trying to solve hard problems every day. And during the interview, we want to try to simulate that experience of giving you a hard problem and seeing how you try to solve it in a 45-minute period. So it's tough, but that's what we try to do, is just capture that primary signal of how your problem solving skills are. And when we talk about problem solving, we're also talking about how you think of making engineering trade-offs. So we're solving problems in the context of software engineering, and we want to understand how you think of the trade-offs that are often made in problem solving in software. And primarily, the 2 trade-offs that we look at are things relating to time and memory. So when you are developing an application or a solution, how do you think about the use of memory in your application, and how do you complete the task or to solve the problem? So these kind of discussions will happen throughout the interview, and the interviewer is constantly looking to see how you think about those things. And when I say it's the trade-off, what happens in software development is that sometimes we choose to make a program faster, meaning that it takes less time, at the expense of that it requires more memory. And sometimes we make it require less memory, but it would be slower. And so these trade-offs are constantly being made and considered when you're developing applications. And we want to see how you think about those. during the interview. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second too. And communication is key, like I said. So we want to get a sense of how you communicate about your code in plain language. So obviously, with companies like Facebook, the language is English. But a lot of the stuff I say here is going to be relevant to companies other than Facebook as well. So if the language they're using is something not English to conduct a job, then the idea just want to see how do you communicate about your code in a normal language. And software is developed in teams, and as you can imagine, you will be working with team members, and being able to communicate about your code and reason about it in a human language is important, and it's part of the job. And also the limits of what you know. So the interviewer will be looking at pushing your boundaries, constantly asking you questions to see when do you stop knowing things. So that's normal, and a lot of the times you might come out of an interview not knowing all the answers to the questions you were asked, and that's okay. So don't feel bad if you don't know or you don't get all the answers right. That's part of the interview, and that's the point. Is they want to see when do you stop knowing things, when do they reach the boundaries of your knowledge. So let's talk about the material and what is covered. We said the material is an important part of the interview process, and being familiar with the interview material is critical to being prepared. So what do we cover in the interview? And some people think, hey, I have an interview with Google or Facebook or somebody, and I need to study on puzzles. I need to practice solving puzzles during interviews. So don't waste time practicing those. Instead, we talk about things that are relating to data structure during your studies in university, and we talk about those topics. So when we think about data structures and algorithms, we think that the important thing of relating to these topics is to understand and not memorize. So it's not useful to come into the interview having memorized a bunch of algorithms or a bunch of data structures and hope that this will be helpful. It's more important that you understand how these data structures and algorithms work and be able to tweak them for solving a unique problem. So, and I usually do this. I forget sometimes, like, what is the difference between a stack and a queue? And how are they different? And which one is which? Which one is LeFO? Which one is FIFO? Which one is, and I think, all right, so a queue in real life is when you have people lining up at the gas station and they're trying to fill up gas. There's a queue of cars, and the first car that enters the queue is the first car that is taken out of the queue to fill up the gas. So it sounds like that's a first in, first out kind of data structure. And so being able to understand this concept behind data structures and recreating some of this understanding during the interview is more important than memorizing which is which and how these things work. So the reason for that is because you need to come in and you need to use this understanding, tweak it around to solve a unique problem that you probably have not seen or encountered before. It's important to be able to discuss the complexity of your code. And so when we talk about complexity, we're talking about, again, the trade-offs relating to space and time. And the topic of complexity is primarily discussed through big O notation. So if you use big O notation, this will be familiar. If you don't know what big O notation means or what complexity analysis is, then that's a very important topic that you're missing. And you would need to practice that and prepare for it before coming to the interview. If somebody cannot talk about the complexity of their code and the performance of it using big O notation, it's going to mean they're not likely able to pass the interview. So it's a critical component of the interview. And if you haven't studied this in your university, I encourage you to take an online course about this. There are tons of resources online that you can access for learning about complexity under the primary topic of data structures and algorithms. So take a look at that. When we are doing interview problems, it's okay to use common library functions. So if you need to access the sorting function of the language you're using, that's okay. You don't need to re-implement sorting, or you don't need to re-implement hashing, unless the problem is asking you to implement hashing, or is asking you to invent some special sorting algorithm. But if sorting is kind of an auxiliary problem that you just need to use sorting to solve a bigger problem, then you don't need to implement that algorithm or that function yourself. It's understood that sorting has been well studied, and a problem that's been solved for years. So we're not going to try to make you solve something that computer scientists spent years solving. We want to see something that you probably haven't encountered before and how you interact with it. And so that's why we also are not going to ask you to implement basic algorithms. So don't expect that you'll come into the interview and be asked to implement binary search or implement quick sort. Again, these are algorithms that have been solved and well understood. So we're not trying to get you to reproduce an algorithm that you memorized. We want to see how you solve a problem you haven't seen before. We also don't ask specific questions about concepts. So what I mean by that is we're not going to ask people to say, hey, how do you manage memory in iOS version 12? These are specific concepts, and it doesn't show your ability to problem solve. It only shows your familiarity with a certain framework or a certain programming language. And so we don't try to touch on that. We're more interested in a higher level thing that shows people's ability to solve problems. Now, unless you're applying to a position that requires you to be an expert about those concepts, we may ask in that case, but otherwise specific concepts are avoided. It's more on the kind of theory and the fundamentals of computer science as demonstrated through data structures and algorithms. And finally, use your most comfortable language. This is probably the the most common question I receive almost on a daily basis. I get messages now that I post things on social media. I get messages from people almost daily saying, "Hey, I want to be a good programmer. I want to get a job at Facebook. I want to start. I want to improve my programming skills. What should I learn? Which programming is the best programming language? Where should I start?" And the answer to this is there isn't a single programming language that is the best. And the same goes when we do interviews. We don't ask people to come in and do an interview in a specific programming language. We just say, hey, use your most comfortable language, and it's going to be fine. If you come in and you're most comfortable writing Java or C++ or PHP or C# or whatever, your interviewer will be able to understand and follow along. And you don't need to learn a language overnight thinking, hey, I'm going to now I have an interview with Facebook and they use PHP at Facebook. So now I have to learn PHP in 2 days and do the interview. So don't worry about that. And if you force yourself to use a language you're not comfortable with during the interview, it's probably going to slow you down and you're going to make mistakes, and it's going to confuse you and confuse the interviewer because you will look like you're not an experienced interviewer. But really, you're just not experienced in that language, which is not important. So I always say use your most comfortable language. And sometimes maybe there is a preference in that if you have a few choices of more than one language that you're comfortable with, then in that case, maybe use the one that is the least verbose. So some languages require you to write a lot of things to accomplish something simple. For example, C or C++. A lot of these languages are low level and they don't give you some things that you can access more easily. People are drawing on the slides. So you can think of if you have more than a choice, think of the languages that are that require you to write less code to achieve things. So like Python, for example, or JavaScript. These are languages that are faster to write quick code with, but make sure you understand the free things that they offer you. So if you're using Python, Python has a lot of magic, and you're able to do crazy things in Python with like one line that would take you a block of code in C++, for example. Make sure you know what this one line is doing if you choose to do that, and that all the specifics and the complexities of that line, make sure you're able to explain anyways, that was a big digression on excuse me, programming languages. So let's move on and talk about the format of the interview. So in the when we talk about the coding interview, uh, there are a few segments or sections that we think about. So the first is we have an intro where you introduce yourself, and this is your chance to learn about the interviewer and share your past experiences. This is just a couple minutes. It's kind of an icebreaker. It doesn't really count too much towards your performance in the interview, just an opportunity to get comfortable and warm up. And then you start coding. So this is the majority of the time where you'll be completing coding questions. Depending on the interview, it might be 1 to 2 questions, depending on the complexity of the question and the interviewer. I usually like to ask 2 questions. One is a kind of a smaller warm-up question that gives the candidate an opportunity to feel more confident. And then we ask the more complex question. So the warm-up question in my mind would usually take 10 minutes to complete, and then the next problem takes about 20 to 25 minutes. So that's a total of about 35 minutes of problem code solving or coding done throughout the interview. So the whole interview is 45 minutes long, with the introduction at the beginning, and at the end we leave a few minutes for buffer. You have about 35 to 40 minutes of spending the time on coding. Sometimes the interviewer might stop you in the middle and moves on to a different part of the question or a different problem entirely. That's okay. Don't feel bad or panic. It might mean different things if they do this. One is that maybe they see you're stuck and you're not making any progress. They're not getting any information from you out of this question. So they say, hey, let's just change the problem and see what happens. Or they might see you're solving this problem too quickly. It's very obvious you are familiar or comfortable, or this problem is too easy for you. They want to see how you solve hard problems. Remember at the beginning, I said the point of the interview is to get a sense of how you approach and tackle hard problems. So they might say, all right, let's see something a little bit challenging for this candidate and how they perform when something is hard in front of them. So don't panic. It's just part of the process that the question might be changed midway. And also, they might have follow-up components. So depending on how you solve the problem, there might be follow-up and say, okay, how can we make it better? How can we improve the code that you wrote, whether from the perspective of the space or the time? How can we make it faster? How can we make it use less memory? Or how can we maybe make the code cleaner or easier to read? So follow-up is important, and it's part of the interview as well. And the next important thing to think about too is being ready to test your code. So this is a really important step that is often overlooked or forgotten by a lot of candidates. And you know, when you write software, anybody who's been writing software and experienced with writing software, you would know that software rarely works completely from the first time you write it. And there's always bugs, there are always mistakes that we make. And that's why we have tests. We have unit tests, we have integration tests, we have manual testing that we do. And this is so that we can verify and validate that the software is doing what we want it to do. So if you come in an interview and you skip this test, and if you don't test your code, it shows that maybe you're not very experienced, and it shows something important is missing from the software development process. So make sure you always test your code, and don't wait for the interviewer to tell you to test your code. Make sure you take the initiative. As soon as you're done writing the code, you say, all right, let's test it. Let's make sure this actually works. And more often than not, you're going to find problems in your code, and that's okay. People make mistakes, and I don't penalize for bugs that people make as long as they catch them through testing. So it shows the maturity and shows the ability to troubleshoot and debug when you go through your code and test it yourself. Now, if you're doing a phone interview, then it'll be done with an online collaborative editor. We'll use that today when I demonstrate some of the interview mechanics. And this is now, interviews are all done online or over the phone. So the other part would have been an interview that we do in person, which we're not doing these days. But normally you would come in and you would solve problems on the whiteboard. Both of those cases, you don't actually get to execute the code. So when I say test the code, I don't mean that you're going to press run or execute and then it's going to work. I mean that you test it by going line by line, manually showing what's happening at each step throughout your program. What does the data look like? What is the performance of your application at each step? So in this case, you're not gonna, if you're doing it on the whiteboard or if you're doing it on the computer, you're not gonna be able to automatically just press run. You have to test it by hand. And then finally, at the end of the interview, we have a chance to ask questions. So this is where you just spend a couple of minutes talking to the interviewer, your time interviewing the company and learning about it. You also want to know, does this company fit you well? And so this is when you get your questions answered. Okay. So we have one more slide, and then we can go on and solve some problems together. So that's when it gets a little bit more fun. So I'll move through this, try to move through this slide quickly. It has a lot of information too, and then we can take a break and ask some questions as well. So let's talk about the steps to a successful interview. Let me back up a little bit here. So when you come in and you're an excited candidate and you're coming in to do an interview with Facebook or some other company, and you're like, all right, this is great, and you get the question, and the first thing that people do after they hear the question, oftentimes they're eager and they jump right to solving the problem. But that's not what you want to do. You don't want to solve the problem right away or start solving the problem right away. There are a few steps you want to take before that. And the first step is to repeat the question back to the interviewer. Make sure you fully understand what's being asked of you and what is the problem. And it sounds like a trivial thing to do, but it's very important. Just paraphrasing the problem back to the interviewer. It takes you 20 seconds probably to do this, but it's very critical because sometimes people hear the question and they misunderstand the premise of it or what it's trying to do. They go on and start solving something that's different from what the interviewer wanted. And then it takes 10, 15, 20 minutes to realize this and think, oh, wait a minute, what are you solving? This is not what I wanted. And then you wasted half of the interview solving the wrong problem. So this simple first step would spare you that wasted time. So make sure you repeat the question back. Now, after that, what do? People will say, all right, I start solving the problem. Not yet. Don't solve the problem yet. Now you want to ask questions about it. So more often than not, the problem would require you to ask follow-up questions about it to understand what it is, the edge cases of the problem, any assumptions that you might be making or certain scenarios that you need to consider. So this is the chance to do that and to have a discussion. Okay, now you're giving me a problem with arrays. What's going on with this array? Is it sorted? What's the data and what kind of data does this array have? How large is this array? Is it so large that it does not fit in memory and I need to worry about that? Maybe that's the premise of the problem. It's handling arrays so large that they don't fit in memory. So in this case, asking those questions is going to reveal more about the problem and allow you to understand it enough to be able to solve it. So now you ask questions, you validated some of the assumptions. Can we assume this? Can we assume that about the data? And next thing you do is you start to think about a solution. So you're not coding yet. Still, we've taken 3 steps and not written any code. And this is important too, that you don't want to write code before you actually have a complete solution in your mind. So this is where you're still talking with the interviewer. Maybe you're using the whiteboard to, if you are in person or if you're in coding on the computer, you can show the data. All right, I'm going to use a pointer. This pointer is going to move throughout the array. It's going to do this. It's going to swap these things. Showing the mechanics of your solution before you actually start coding it and proving out the idea that, hey, this idea will work. Let me prove it out on even a sample example or a sample data. So you try to make sure that this approach will work before you write any code. Again, this is important because if you start coding before validating your solution actually works, then you will have written code for the wrong solution. And that's also wasted time. So now you're going to, once you're at a point where you're comfortable and you feel like, all right, I think this works now, I've validated it, and I think we can now go on and start coding. So throughout the whole time that you're coding, you'll be explaining your thought process. You're talking to the interviewer throughout the entire process. Anything you're writing, you're explaining. I'm writing now a for loop that's going to go over the array from the beginning to the end. Now here I have an if statement that's going to check if these two things are going on. Now I have a while loop. Now I have whatever. So anything you add in the code, it's almost like you're narrating the code, or those comments that you would put in line into your code, you're going to say them out loud and tell them to your interviewer. If you run into trouble, you can ask for a hint sometimes. Don't overuse this or abuse it, so that you don't want to ask for so many hints that the interviewer is effectively solving the problem for you. So only use it sparingly if you get really stuck. And then the next step, which again is very important, like I said, is running through your solution with test cases. The whole time talking out loud and explaining to your interviewer why you're choosing these cases, what's going on as you're testing your code. And finally, you iterate. So this is the last step. And like I said, some problems you solve will have follow-up, where the interviewer might change the problem and say, hey, what if this happens? Or they say, can we make this better? Can we make this code run more efficiently? Can we make it cleaner? Can we make it faster, use less memory, whatever? So this is where the opportunity to improve the code or iterate by making the problem more complex and trying to solve it still. Okay, so we are now at the point where we can switch to solving some problems together and looking at some of those interview problems and doing them together. Let's pause here for a minute and see if there are questions that have come in since the last little break we took. I see a lot of questions in the chat. I don't
All right, it looks like Murtadha has frozen. I think it's on his side. So please feel free to chat more questions. Love that so many people have questions. We are logging them so that we can make sure we have some time to jump back.
You guys hear me? I think I dropped out for a second.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Like a little, almost like انطفت الكهرباء.
So we have quite a few questions that have come in.
So I lost all the history when I got kicked out, so I can't see
No problem. So one of the first kind of a set of questions that came in were around how you found your how you got that first internship. So I think we have a lot of people who would be interested in becoming interns at Facebook or similar. So what that work?
Okay, so I was a student in university, and in the university I went to usually works with companies to bring them to campus and get them to interview people. So I had that. I was fortunate that Facebook was coming to my campus to recruit from it, and so I applied for the position. I applied online, and when I sent in my resume, and then I was invited for an interview a couple of days later, and it was kind of shocking. I thought, hey, this is probably not real, but why is Facebook interested in interviewing me? And when I was a student, I always avoided applying to companies like Facebook because I thought I'm not good enough to be at Facebook, or I applied to little companies, to startups, to companies that nobody heard of, because I didn't think I was smart enough or good enough to work at a place like Facebook or Microsoft or Google or any of these big tech companies that were very competitive. So I wouldn't even bother applying to them, even though it was, a few clicks um, to apply. And they would come every year to my university and recruit, but I thought it's not for me. It's for smarter people. And one day I was just, all right, I'm just gonna try it. I was feeling crazy, and I thought, all right, I'll just submit a resume. What is there to lose? And so I submitted my resume, and um, sure enough, a couple of days later, they emailed saying, "Hey, we want to invite you for an interview." And I thought maybe there was a mistake. This can't be real. So I looked again, and like sure enough, that's just really interview. And I thought, okay, this is now my chance to really prepare. And I had only like 3 or 4 days to prepare for this interview. So I spent the next couple of days staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning practicing interview questions. And I would come back from work at the time I was working, and I would come back from work every day and stay up all night practicing interview problems. I just went online and typed into Google interview questions Facebook, and and then I started seeing examples of questions that I needed to be prepared for, which we'll see a few of today. And I think I probably solved more than 100 questions in those few days. And so I was getting a lot of practice. And this is what I encourage you to do. When you have an interview coming up with Facebook or anybody else, if you're trying to practice those interview problems, don't try to do 1 or 5 or 10 of them. Try to do at least 100. And I know it sounds crazy, but really, once you reach that point where you've done a lot of these problems, then you get to a level of comfort and familiarity, and this pattern and this process of solving problems becomes so much more natural and easier for you. So this is what I recommend if you're trying to prepare is do a lot of these problems, and you'll feel, once you start seeing a problem, you'll feel like, okay, I know how to do this. This is similar to this other problem that I looked at, and you start seeing patterns, and you feel a lot more comfortable with it. Okay, so a lot of questions are coming in. How do we want to do this?
We have a couple hands raised.
Okay, do we want to prioritize hands raised?
I think Abdul Rahman, I think your hand has been raised for a while. Do you want to jump in?
Abdul Rahman al-Khatib. Do we have to unmute people, or they can unmute themselves?
You should be able to unmute. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, I could unmute myself. Hi.
Hey.
Yeah, this is Abdurrahman. I'm from Mosul, but currently I'm living in Turkey. I have a question. I don't know if this is the place that you can share, but hopefully you can share with us this information, like what happened after the interview, like in case of how they evaluate, and I don't know if there's a possibility, like, okay, they had a position and they need you, but after the interview something changed and they decided, oh, okay, let's pause a bit and let's cancel. I don't know, like if they are like deciding to not fill a position at this time, or like decide later. So I'm just asking this because I had once an interview for a market specialist, and I from my side, I think that I prepared very well for the interview. And at the same time, actually, the market special position, they also asked for a market special for a Persian for Farsi speaker.
Yeah.
And my friend, he speaks Farsi. He also applied and he had the interview. And what made me curious is that we both follow the interview process. There was three levels, and we stopped at the same level. So again, I'm sorry if maybe this is something you cannot share, but we
Yeah,
both are curious. We both are curious at what happened, why they posed up, both of
this
us.
was with Facebook.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm not trying to avoid answering the question, but I actually don't know what happened. It's probably very specific to the situation, and I don't have visibility into those specifics. A lot of sometimes what happens is a case by case basis as well. And it sounds like this was not even an engineering position, which
Yeah, yeah.
recruiting for positions that are not engineering positions is also entirely different. So there are a lot of ways that this is different and unfamiliar
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, actually, yeah, because like the mark spells the position was like, I felt like it's very well related to my current position, where I
Yeah.
am working like as a communication with community position in UNHCR. So I feel like that I had a chance, but I don't know what happened later. Like, we both
And if
stopped at the
you
same.
and Abdurrahman, I apologize to cut you off. I want to
Yeah,
make sure we give chance for other people. If you want
yeah,
to
yeah.
chat separately about this, maybe I can give
Okay.
you more information
Yeah,
from
that will be better.
if
Okay.
you want me to connect you with the people
Yeah. Okay. But so
who
just
have
maybe
more.
for others, like for other people attending, maybe you can share with us like a bit of like a brief things that how the evaluation happens after the interview. Maybe you can explain it for others.
So again, depending on the position and how the every position is evaluated differently. For engineering positions that we're talking about, your evaluation is done in the interviewer comes in and they will provide their evaluation of this particular interview, and usually there's more than one interview that have happened. So after every interviewer submits their evaluation, then we come and we look at all of it together and say, all right, this person said this was good, this person said it's not good, let's reconcile. If there's disagreement, we try to talk about it. Sometimes if they can't agree, excuse me, then we ask to go back and do one more interview, maybe a follow-up to get further signal to break the tie. If two interviewers say like, I think this person had a communication problem, and the other interviewer says, I think the communication was great. So we say, all right, now we have two people disagreeing about one of the aspects of the interview. So let's go back and ask a third person to interview and focus on communication and give us some feedback on the communication. Um, so that's what happens, and then at the end, a decision is made about hiring this person or not. Okay, so I see some questions.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your questions, Abdurrahman. I see some questions coming in through chat. Does Facebook work remotely around the globe? What about time zone overlaps? Um, so Facebook, in terms of Facebook has a lot of jobs, right? And you know, there's, I don't know, like more than 40,000 or more people working at Facebook these days. So it's a huge company with a lot of positions. In terms of engineering, the engineering roles are usually focused in being in person. Now, of course, right now we're going through a crazy time and everybody's working remotely, but the engineering positions at Facebook during normal times are in offices where people go in person and work. So we don't have usually we don't have remote engineering arrangements. Now, with the world changing, I don't know what's going to happen and how this will look. But usually it's been that if you get an engineering position at Facebook, you have to relocate to an engineering office, which for Facebook, the Middle East office, the nearest one to the Middle East is in London. There's been, I think, other offices there's one in Dublin as well. I think Singapore is also maybe another opportunity for office location in the region. But of course, that's for engineering only. There's a Facebook office in Dubai for other roles as well. So that's a kind of the state of working for Facebook. How can we learn and apply to work with little cash income? That's a great question. So learning online, there are a lot of things online that are free. So when I was a student, actually, to prepare me for interviews, I took an online course on data structures and algorithms from Stanford, and it was free on Coursera.com. It was a free course, and it was really great. I learned a lot from it, and it helped me prepare for interviews. Will you share this interview after? It's there is so this instance I may not share, but there is a recorded version of this presentation that I can share with you guys, that we've hosted on Facebook with a very similar version of this workshop, so I can share that for you later. Have you ever been in a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg? I have actually, yeah, once or twice, I think, long time ago. Facebook is now so large that being in a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg is not very common. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. There's a lot of questions. This is great. I want to make sure we go back to the content I had for you guys. I think we got to an interesting point. So keep those questions. We'll come back to them. And I want to make sure we solve some interview problems together. That was, I think, the most interesting part of this session. So let's return to the slides. Okay. Let's share the screen. Okay, so now we did this already. So now we're gonna do a problem, and this is kind of an example of a problem that you may get from an interview. You say you come in, your interviewer introduces themselves and say, all right, my name is this, blah blah blah, and now I will have this interview problem for you. Given an array in which every number is between 1 and n, determine if there are any duplicates. And so, okay, what did we say? What do you do? I'm gonna look at your replies in the chat. So tell me, what do you do when when you hear the question? What do you do after? Let's see if I can view the chat. Okay, so people are talking about sorting the array, and that sounds like you're trying to solve the problem. What did we say before you solve the problem? What do you do when you hear the question? What do you do to it? Yeah, so somebody's saying ask if you understand the question, but you said before you ask anything, what do you do? Step number 1 from the previous slides. Repeat the question, yes. So you want to repeat the question and you say, all right, let me make sure I understand this. So to make sure I'm on the same page, you want me to write an algorithm to determine if an array has any duplicates. And the interviewer says, that's correct. That's what I want you to do. Okay, so now you repeated the question. You're on the same page with the interviewer. What is the next step? People already mentioned it, which is that you want to ask some questions about the problem. So let's ask some questions. What are some questions that you may ask about this problem? So what are examples of questions you need to ask to understand this problem? So somebody's saying, how many elements are there in the array? So that's a good question. Maybe not exactly how many elements, but we want to see, is this number of elements in the array so large that we need to worry about it? So we don't care if it's 10 or 15 because we can handle both, but if the number is so large that it doesn't fit in memory, maybe we need to do some special handling. So the interviewer will say, it's not so large that you have to worry about it. The number of the elements in the array, you can assume it's reasonable that it can fit in memory at once. One question was, do you want to count the elements or just display them? So that's a good question. Is do we want to display? Like some people are unmuted. So yeah, do we want to display the duplicates? What do we want to do with the duplicates? Do we want to? Okay, now I'm muted. You guys can hear me? Yeah. Do you want to Do you want to count the duplicates? Tell us the positions of the duplicates, tell us where they are or what they are, or just simply return true or false if there is a single instance of a duplicate. So clarifying what the return results of the question is important too. What else would you ask about this problem before you can solve it? Yeah, what type of numbers are they? Are they all integers? Are they floats, or do they have fractions? So in this case, we'll say they're all integers. Do I care about time performance? One of the questions here, and the answer is always yes. So you can assume that you don't need to ask this question. The interviewer will always want you to care about time performance and want you to produce the most efficient solution from both the perspective of time and space. Should I care about memory size? Again, the answer is yes, you should, and you should try to produce the solution that has the best memory usage. So a few questions that I've also thought of is, can I destroy or modify the array? This is important. If you're going to operate on some data, whether it's an array or any other type of data, you want to understand if modifying this array or this data is valid, or is it only is it read only? So in this case, we'll say you cannot modify the array. We want to treat it as a read-only array. Can I use additional space? We'll also say additional space. Will the array ever be empty? In this case, it may not matter if it's ever empty. So maybe you will solve it in a way that your solution works if it's empty or not. Are they all integers? Somebody already asked this. What type of data is in the array? Maybe it's a bunch of strings in the array and we have to before we operate on them. So now we've asked all the questions about this, and we feel like, okay, we have a good understanding of what problem wants us to do. So next we can start to think about a solution. All right, how can I solve this problem? So I have an array and I'm trying to determine if it has duplicates. I just need to return true or false if the array has a duplicate or not. I don't have, I can't modify the array or destroy it. I don't want to use additional space. So what are my options? How can I solve this problem? If people want to share their ideas for a possible solution, we can try to see if unmuting yourself works. If you want to speak, it might turn into chaos. I don't know. So people are saying use a dictionary. Now, if you use a dictionary, that's using additional space, right? And we said we want to solve it without using additional space. So using a dictionary is not really going to work in this case. Somebody said comparing. Yes, we will need to compare. I need to think, all right, how do we compare? Oh, somebody is saying sort them. And if you sort the array, you're modifying it. And we said you can't modify the array. So sorting is not an option right now. Somebody saying we use 2 pointers, which sounds like we probably need to do that. So we need to look at the array and we say, all right, I can't modify it. I can't use extra space. So my only option is to compare elements in the array, probably using 2 pointers. And if we say, all right, we'll take a pointer and stop it at each element in the array and then compare that element with the rest of the array. So I'll move through my array having 2 pointers. I'll stop at each element and say, all right, let's use the other pointer to compare this element with the rest of the array. And at any point, if I find 2 elements that are equal, that means I have a duplicate. I can say, all right, return true, there's a duplicate. Otherwise, if I complete this process of looping through every element and I don't find 2 elements that are equal, it means there are no duplicates. So it sounds like to complete this, I will need 2 nested loops. One loop will move through the array for each element to stop at it, and another loop to move the second pointer throughout the array. So if we look at the code for this, it'll look like this. I have an array, or I have a function, sorry, that's In this case, we're using Java, and this function returns a Boolean, and it takes an integer array, and it's going to loop through the array from 0 to the end. At each point, it's going to also stop and loop again from the current position to the end. So I have two nested loops, the I loop and the J loop. And then inside the inner loop, I'm going to compare I and J plus 1, the index at the position, or the element at position I and the element at position J plus 1, and I'm going to compare them. If they're equal, it means I found a duplicate, so we can return true and not bother with the rest of the array. Otherwise, if we complete this and never find two elements equal, then we can return false. So now, what is the complexity of this algorithm in terms of time? How much time is this algorithm going to require to complete? So when we think about big O, so that's correct. So it's going to be n squared of n squared. And the reason is because we have these two loops nested inside of each other. On average, these loops are going to require to look at the array n squared times. And the way we extract this answer of n squared, there's a little mathematical formula that gives us this answer. Again, if this sounds like foreign language to you, what is this O, what is this N, why is there O of n squared? If this makes no sense to you, then I encourage you to study on big O analysis of algorithms. And this, like I said, is an integral part of the interview. So make sure you go back and learn about complexity analysis and using big O notation to determine how long an algorithm requires to complete. So now we say, okay, algorithms that are doing O of n squared, it is a good starting point, but we can do better. And let's see how we can do better by relaxing some of the constraints that we talked about. Before we do that though, there's a bug in this code. There's something that's going to make this code actually not execute. There's going to be a runtime error. Can you spot it? What the runtime error is? Muhammad Abdul Karim says out of range. Yeah, where do you think the out of range is? You can unmute yourself if you want to say. Jihad, did it say J plus 1? Yeah, so that's correct. So A and in the if statement where we have A of I is where we're comparing A of I and A of J plus 1. This is going to go out of bounds because the J index is going to the last element of the array. And when we go to the last element of the array and we try to look at the element after that, we're going to have an index out of bound exception in Java. So this will be a runtime error, and this code actually will not execute when we run it. So it's important to test the code, and this is to show, hey, when you test your code, you're going to reach a point. If you test your code with 3 elements, then you'll have a point where J is going to equal 2, and you're going to try to access J plus 1, which 2 plus 1 is 3. So you're going to try to access element at index 3 in an array of 3 elements, which would mean you're trying to access an element outside of the bounds of the array. And that's going to give you an exception. So when you test this code, you'll catch your exception. So we'll need to modify this and fix it. So now we say, all right, let's go back to the part where we iterate on the problem and we try to solve it in a more efficient way, and we relax one of the constraints. Remember I said sometimes there will be follow-up discussions after you solve a problem. So if we relax the constraints of not using or not modifying the array, so we say it's okay to modify the array. How can we improve the solution and make it faster if we're able to modify the array? So any suggestions or ideas? Somebody saying using query. I'm not sure what that means. But somebody already suggested an idea earlier that required modifying the array. Any thoughts? Using a while loop. It's not, yeah, while loop is not going to help us. Sorting the array would help us indeed. And so if we sort the array, then we don't need to scan for every element. We scan the rest of the array or the entire array. And that's what was giving us the n squared, because we were looking at the n elements in the array for each element, we're doing n comparisons because we're comparing it with the rest of the array, and that was giving us n squared. But if we sort the array, then we will be guaranteed that if there are duplicates, they will be next to each other. So if we sort the array, then we just scan the array from left to right, always comparing neighboring elements. In that case, we don't actually need to search the entire array each time. We just need to compare neighbors. And so that'll spare us this n squared complexity. So if we look at the code and we say, all right, we're going to sort the array initially, and then we're going to write a for loop that's going to go from 0. In this case, we're making sure to account for this length minus 1, so we don't go over the beyond the last element. And now we're going to compare I and I plus 1. If they're ever equal, it means we have a duplicate, return true. And if we don't find two neighboring elements that are equal, then we're guaranteed that there are no duplicates, because in a sorted array, duplicates would be next to each other. And now we can return false. So now, what is the complexity of this algorithm? So people are saying this is n. Of course, the for loop has an n complexity, but when we talk about a complexity of an algorithm, we're talking about the overall or the global complexity of the solution, which is usually determined by the slowest part of the algorithm. So what is the slowest part? Now, the for loop is a n complexity or linear complexity, but what about the sorting? What's the complexity of sorting? Yeah, so somebody's saying we should know the big O of the sorting algorithm. And if we assume that we're using the library of the sorting in Java, it probably is going to use some form of merge sort or quick sort or something that we know that in the best algorithms, in the best sorting algorithms in the world are going to perform in n log n. So the overall complexity of this algorithm becomes n log n because of the sorting. So that's going to determine the global complexity. Yeah, people are saying the complexity will depend on what sorting algorithm is used, but even assuming that's true, assuming there are some sorting algorithms that are going to be n squared, but we assume in this case we're going to use the best sorting algorithm in the world, and the best sorting algorithm in the world is going to give us n log n complexity. So, so then that's going to be the overall complexity of this code. Now, for people who write Java code, you would notice that there's actually also a mistake or a bug in this code. I don't know if you can spot it. It's only specific to Java, so only if you're a Java developer you would spot it. Take a second to look at that code and see. So somebody was saying maybe the sort function makes a new array, and it's definitely in the invocation of the sort, but it's not that it makes a new array, but that actually you can't invoke sort like this on a primitive data structure in Java. So again, this is a very specific mistake to Java. A is an array of a primitive type of primitive integers, and that type of variable in Java is not actually an object. It doesn't have methods that you can invoke on it. So it's a primitive array which doesn't expose a method called sort that you can invoke. The proper way of sorting an array of this type in Java is doing arrays.sort and passing it the array. So again, this is only a specific problem to Java, and you would only know it if you're a Java developer. The point of showing this is to say, use your most comfortable language, or use the language that you know the best. Because if you come in and you write this, and you make this kind of mistake, it would seem like maybe you don't actually know how to write code, or maybe you just don't know how to write Java code. And the interviewer will be confused. Is it that you don't know how to code, or you don't know how to code in Java? So in order to avoid these confusions, make sure you use your most comfortable language, so you don't make these little mistakes in syntax or semantics, and confuse yourself and the interviewer. Okay, let's move on and try to improve this one more time. So we said this is n log n in terms of time complexity. We're still not using additional space. Now, if we relax one more constraint and we say it's okay to use additional space, can we make the solution faster? And some people have already mentioned ideas to make the solution faster. But I want to hear one more time from you guys. Do you think there are ways that we can make it faster than n log n if we remove the constraints that we are not able to use additional space? So what do you think? There were some ideas earlier about something, using something that allows us to solve this problem in linear time, but it required using additional space. Can we Google at the interview? No, you can't Google at the interview. If you get stuck on something like, oh, I'm not sure, if when I use a sorting algorithm, do I pass it a comparator or not? And if you're unsure of like an unusual API and you need to figure it out, then usually your interviewer will say, let's assume the API is this. And they'll say, let's assume the function takes a comparator and it's the first argument, and that's how it is. So the point of that is not more about like your knowledge, testing your knowledge, because it's understood that if you get stuck on an API call, you can Google it and find the documentation. But it's more about trying to see how you're problem solving it. So if you agree and say, all right, I think this is how you use a comparator, I would need to double check, the interviewer will not be penalizing you because you incorrectly use an uncommon API call. Okay, so let's talk about the use of a dictionary or a hash map in order to improve the performance of this algorithm even further. So we say the reason we had to compare every element with every other element is because we just wanted to see if another instance of that element existed in the previous way we solved this problem. But what if we find a way to look things up quickly? Now, we had to search the entire array each time because we didn't have a faster way to see if I'm looking at an element, if I'm looking at a number 5 in the array, I want to see if there's another 5 in the array, I have to search the array. But we know that there is a data structure that allows us to search things in almost constant time without searching the entire data structure. We can return results of does this element exist or not pretty quickly. And that's a hash map or a hash table or a dictionary, whatever you want to call it. It allows us to answer the question, does this element exist, pretty quickly without having to search the entire container. So we say, what if we put all the elements in a dictionary as we look at them? But before we put it in a dictionary, we check, have we already added this element to the dictionary before? If we have, it means we have a duplicate. And so we say, all right, we found a duplicate, let's do that. But if we haven't, then we can say, all right, let's put it in here and later see if we find it again. So now we're going to switch to JavaScript, and this is how the code would look like. We start with an empty dictionary, or in JavaScript, a hash whatever. I think it's called a dictionary. Or it's an object in JavaScript, and this is how you initialize it. So we start with an empty dictionary, and then we loop over the array. Before we add the new element to the dictionary, we check if it was already there. If we have already seen this element, we return true. It means we have a duplicate. If we haven't, then we simply add it to the dictionary and assign it the value true. And at the end, we return false if we didn't find any duplicates. So now, what is the complexity of this solution in terms of time and space? What do you guys think? Give me some big O answers. So people are saying n log n. So now it's O of n in terms of time because we only have one for loop that's happening n times. So that's correct. So it's O of n in terms of time. But how about space? Now, we've introduced extra space that is used for storing the dictionary. So actually, the solution will have O of n time complexity and O of n space complexity, because we'll need basically n amounts of space to store the dictionary. In this case, n refers to the length of the array, by the way. I should have mentioned this earlier for people who haven't studied big O notation. But when we're talking about n, it's how many elements there are in the array. So it's going to require us n additional amount of space to solve this problem this way. And we're going to need n steps in time because we're doing n comparisons. Okay, so now we solve this problem. So you saw how in this problem, there were 3 different ways to solve it. The first way was n squared. It didn't require additional space, and it didn't require us to modify the array. So those were the constraints, and that's the best we could do with that, n squared. Now, when we relaxed one of the constraints and we said, if we can modify the array, then we found out we can solve it in n log n. And finally, we said, if we can use additional space, we can actually solve it in linear time, but also by requiring linear space. And that's what I meant when I talked about the trade-offs. You saw how here, if we don't use extra space, the best we can do to solve this problem is n log n or n squared. But if we use additional space, then we can do it faster. And so here we're talking about the trade-offs, and should we solve this problem faster but require more space? Or should we optimize for memory and use the least amount of memory possible, but at the same time make the solution slower? So these are the kind of discussions you have with your interviewer. And usually you say, hey, I can solve this in 3 different ways. Which one do you want? Do we want to optimize for time, or do we want to optimize for space? Okay, so now let's do one more problem, and then I'll stop talking and start listening to your questions more. This time I'm going to try to solve this problem live, like I would in an interview. So this is a problem that you might get in an interview. Say, given a tree, determine if it's a binary search tree. Okay, so what do we do? So first thing you do is you repeat the question back to the interviewer, and you say, all right, I want to make sure I understand. You want me to determine if a tree is a binary search tree? And say, yes, that's correct. So now, what do we do next? We ask questions about it and talk about things that we should consider. So a few things that we would talk about here is, what is a binary search tree anyway? Making sure that we understand and agree on the definition with the interviewer about what it means to have a binary search tree. The next thing is, how is the tree structure represented? So to clarify point number 1, a binary search tree is a tree that has everything to the left of the root node smaller or equal to the root node, and everything to the right of the root node larger or equal to the root node. So that condition has to hold throughout the entire tree. Now, the tree structure is usually represented as a root node. You receive the root node and has a left child and a right child, and from that root node you access the rest of the tree. Now we might discuss advantages of using an iterative versus a recursive solution. What are the trade-offs of using iterations versus recursion? And what do we gain or lose from each of these? And finally, we talk about the runtime of the solution. How much memory does it use? How much are we okay to use extra memory? Should we worry about that? So in this case, we'll try to optimize everything. We'll try to optimize time and memory equally. And I'm going to switch to this tool called CoderPad, which is used for interviews. So this is what we use when we interviewing people over the phone. So let me see how to do this. Okay, sharing my CoderPad. Okay. You guys can see the new window now, the Chrome tab. Shelly, is it working?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So when you join an interview with Facebook or probably other companies as well, you will receive often a link to this tool called CoderPad that allows you to collaborate with your interviewer on solving the problem. I mentioned using an online collaborative tool, which is this one. and it'll have this like, welcome to the interview, blah, blah, blah. So usually I just erase this when I start and start with a fresh slate, and I would select the programming language. So now I'm going to solve it in Python, this problem. So I'm going to write a function that's going to determine if a tree is a binary search tree. So my function will be called isBST, and it's going to receive the root node of a tree. I'm going to use recursion on this problem. So if so a few things to consider for this problem is, when I receive a node, if the node is a leaf node, or if a node is if a node is an empty node, let's say. So if root, or actually let's just name it node so that we're not confused. So I'm going to receive a node, and I'm going to check if this node is a valid BST. So if the node is an empty node, so node equals none, that's the special case, and that's going to be the base case for my recursion, then I'm just going to consider it to be a valid BST. So I'll return true. So return true if it's a none node. And now we're going to test the conditions of a BST. So we said a BST, in order for a BST to be valid, the left node needs to be smaller than the current node, smaller or equal to the current node, and the right node needs to be equal or larger than the current node. So what I'm going to test if there's a violation of the I'm going to test if there's a violation of the BST conditions. So a violation happens is if the left node is larger than the root. So I'm going to do if node.left is larger than the current node, then that's a violation. We can return false. Similarly, I'm going to check if node.right is smaller than the current node. That's also a violation. So I'm going to return false here as well. So there are two scenarios where there's a violation. Otherwise, if there isn't a violation on the left or not a violation on the right, oh, the screen froze. Let's try it again. Screen sharing is paused. Okay, looks like it's back. People see it now. So now I just wrote these conditions of if the left node is larger than the node, then return false. If the right node is smaller than the node, return false. And if neither of these are the case, then it means, hey, this BST so far is valid. So let's continue evaluating it at deeper levels. So we're going to check is BST on the left side, and we're going to check is BST on the right side. And we're actually going to return the results of those two. So we validate that the tree is valid on the left side and get the results of that. And then we validate that the tree is valid on the right side, and we AND these results together, a logical AND, Boolean AND, and we return that, and we're done. So, and then I say, all right, I'm done. I've solved this problem. Give me the job. But you know, I forgot something important here, which is that I didn't test it. So I need to actually test this code. So let's run through some test cases. And now I'm going to, and again, you're normally on a whiteboard, this is much easier, but if you're doing it in CoderPad, then you have to also learn how to use this tool and test things this way. So now if my tree looks like this, so in this case, this is not a valid BST because I have, on the left side, it's fine. 3 is less than 5, so it's fine. But I have 4 on the right side. It should be larger or equal to 5, but it's not. So let me test that my code is going to prove this out. So this is my input. And so at the beginning, I'll start out with node is equal to 5. So node is not none. So it's not going to hit that condition. So we'll go to the next check, which is going to compare node.left with node. is saying, is it greater? And in this case, it's not greater because 3 is not greater than 5. So it's going to pass. And then it'll go on the next check, and it's going to check, is node.right less than node? Node.right is 4, and node is 5. So in this case, yes, it is less. So that condition is going to be true, which means it'll return false, which is what we wanted. So we want this to tell us false. So that's good. It worked. And next, we want to check to validate this works with another example when it's a valid VST. So let's try this. So we start with node is equal to 5. We're going to check it with the left side. It doesn't violate. We're going to check it with the right side. It doesn't violate. So now we go on to the next to the statement, which is going to call is BST on node.left. So now node is equal to 3. And when it comes to here, it's going to check, we don't have a left child or a right child. Oh, interesting. So now I'm trying to access node.left, but we don't actually know if node, we haven't checked if it exists. So we need to check that node.left is not equal to none. And this, and so I need to do the same here. So I need to fix this here. So I make sure now node.left exists before I try to compare it. So in this case, when we're looking at the 3 node, node.left doesn't exist, node.right doesn't exist. So we're going to invoke isBST on the left child of 3, which is none. It's going to come here, and it's going to, so now node is equal to none. This is the child of 3. And so that right away will return true. And then node will once more be equal to none. This was the left child of 3. Now the right child of 3 is being called here, also equal to none. So now both of these are returning true. So true and with true. So 3 will tell us, hey, it's true. This is a valid EST. So now we go back to where we were with 5, when node was 5, and is going to check node.right. So node.right now makes the value of node equal to 7. So for 7, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to check the left hand, it doesn't have children. So now we're going to check none, which is the left child of 7. And we're going to check if when node is none, the right child of 7. Both of them will give us true. True and with true is true. So now 7 will return true as well. And then we're adding the results from 3 and 7, which are both true. It'll give us true here for 5. So now we validated that this works. So somebody was commenting, hey, what if the left or right is null? I would get a null reference error. That's correct. And I corrected it here when I checked that they're not null. Okay. What else? What did I miss here? Do you see other bugs in my code? Do people notice other mistakes I made? I don't have main defined. It's okay. It's okay to not define main. We can just focus on the function itself. You can assume that you know how to define the main method and invoke this function. So you saw how I actually forgot to do the null check, and if I didn't test my code, I wouldn't have corrected the mistake. So that was important to do the test and correct my mistake here. But also there's another mistake here. I'm comparing node.left with node. And these are not numbers, these are integers. You can't, or sorry, these are objects. Node.left is potentially a node object or none, and node is also an object. So comparing two objects with this doesn't make sense. So I need to do something like node.left.value, compare that with node.value, and same thing with the right side. So I need to fix this. And again, if I was closely testing, I would have realized this during testing, but I was kind of running through it too fast and I missed this mistake. So when you test, make sure you're as thorough as possible through testing your code so you can catch these errors. Now, there is still one more problem with this code. And if we think about a slightly more complex use case, so if we look at, for example, a tree that looks like this. So a tree like this is going to appear valid according to my algorithm, because my algorithm will say, okay, we have a 5. We check the 5 against 3 and 7. They both respect the rule of the BST because 3 is less than 5 and 7 is greater than 5. So we say, okay, this is valid. Then we look at 3, and 3 also respects it because it doesn't have a left child, so it's fine. And 10 is larger than 3, and it's on the right side of 3, so it's fine. We have a valid BST here, so we say, but there's a violation because 10 is in the left subtree of 5, and 10 is larger than 5. So 10 shouldn't appear on the left side of 5. 10, if it appears, it would have to appear as a child of 7. But in this case, it appears here, and so we have a violation. And it looks like the approach we're currently following of comparing a node with its immediate children is actually not enough. We need to compare a node somehow with all of its descendants, or conversely, we need to look at each node and see, does it respect the range it has to fall within based on its parents? So the reason 10 is a problem is because one of the parents of 10 is a 3, so 10 has to be larger than 3. But also, one of the parents or grandparents of 10 is a 5, so 10, or this node here, has to be between 3 and 5 in order for it to be valid. And 10 is outside the range of 3 and 5, so in this case, it's not valid. So the way we're solving this problem by comparing a node with its immediate children is not sufficient. We need to pass around a range of what is permitted for each node to be in. So the range starts at, for the beginning, starts with -infinity to infinity for the first node, because anything can be at the beginning of the first node. And then when we get to 3, the range here becomes, what are the possible values that 3 can be? Well, 3 can be anything from -infinity to, let me see how to do this without messing up. So 3, the value for 3 can be anywhere from -infinity to 5, which it is. So hey, 3 is in a good place. It's in the range. And the range for 7 needs to be from 5 to infinity. So you see how each time we're adjusting the range based on the value of the parent and the range of the parent. So each time we take the range of the parent, and then we replace either the right bound or the left bound, depending on if we're going in the array right or left. For 10, the range for 10 is going to be, we look at the range for 3, and we know it needs to be larger than 3, but less than 5. We still need to respect the right bound of, or the upper bound of 3. So the value, the range for 10 has to be between 3 and 5, and this way we know that 10 is outside the range and it's a violation. So it seems like we have to actually update the code here to write something different. And I'll switch back to my slides and share with you the completed solution for this problem. But you get the idea that in this case, we tried to rush too fast through solving this problem without validating that the approach actually works. Or without completely validating the approach works, because we didn't test it with more complex use cases. So the valid solution for this is going to look like this, where we have, we will actually need a helper function that's going to receive the minimum and the maximum for the range that we accept. And at each step, we check at the beginning, if the node is none, we say a none node is a valid VST, so return true. And then we move on to check if the value of the node is within the range, or sorry, if the value of the node is outside the range, we return false. But if it's not outside the range, then we go on and test the children of that node. We look at the left child of that node by also adjusting the bounds of the range. So when we look at the left child, we adjust the upper bound because this next check needs to be smaller than the current node. And when we look at the right child, we adjust the lower bound because this next check needs to be larger than the value of the current node. So you see how we're passing node.value as the new minimum or the new maximum, depending on which way we're testing. And that's it. We start out by checking the tree at the beginning by passing the bounds of minus infinity to infinity. And it looks like we're missing a closing parenthesis here, but so that's a complete solution for this problem. And I wanted to show this to you to see how sometimes if you don't validate your idea sufficiently before you code it, you can start writing code that's going in the wrong direction. And it's probably possible to correct the code we wrote and go back and fix it to make it look like this, but it would be better to avoid that and get to the solution right away. So showing you a scenario that could be avoided by validating the idea enough before you move forward. Okay, so I think I've talked enough. It's now almost midnight for you guys. So I can stop here and just spend the whatever remaining time we have answering questions. I know there are a lot of questions from people, but I wanted to make sure we cover these examples and spend enough time on them before we turn to questions. So I'll turn off my slides and just listen to you. So you can, I don't know, Shelly, how do you want to do this? Do you want us to just look at questions from the chat, or do we want to?
Yeah, let's take some of the original questions, and if other questions have come up that people want to ask. There were a few questions earlier around if companies like Facebook will hire Iraqis and will hire people from different locations in general. And also, how does that factor into the interview process?
Yeah, so companies like Facebook definitely hire Iraqis. I mean, I'm Iraqi. Surely I had the privilege or the advantage of studying abroad, and that made it easier. But there are people who are hired from Iraq or other countries directly while they're there, and they get relocated. Definitely, it's challenging and it's competitive, but it's possible. And the idea is, going back to what we talked about of like, how do you get interviews, how to get noticed by the company so that you can get the interview. Once you get the interview, then the rest of it doesn't matter if you're Iraqi or not, because you're now in the pool of candidates that are being interviewed, and it's up to you to prove yourself as a candidate who's able to perform well. So yeah, but it's of course harder being from Iraq, because Facebook doesn't have active recruiters coming to Iraq and meeting Iraqis to hire them. So in that sense, it's more challenging for somebody from Iraq to be noticed. But some of the other ways I mentioned, participating in coding competitions or hackathons or these opportunities where you stand out and you get seen is a great way to give yourself an advantage and have a better chance at getting the interview. Do Facebook hire interns in the MENA region? Yes, they hire interns. I think one of the countries that we hire from a lot is in the region is Egypt. I've met a lot of people from Egypt, and it's a matter of people in Egypt being very active, and they participate in these coding challenges, and they produce really skilled candidates. And so I think for Iraqis who want to be competitive, they have to look at what's happening in countries like Egypt and say, all right, what are they doing? What are the Egyptians doing, or what are the other countries doing, where there are a lot of people from those countries coming out to work at Facebook, and how can we learn from that? And so I think what Mosul Space is doing is great. It's helping people prepare themselves and their skills. What Recoded is doing is great too, to give that training. But also you have to go beyond that. You have to go beyond the Mosul Space and the Recoded training, and you have to invest in your own self-learning. So, you know, the programs that teach you, even a complete university degree, is often not sufficient to pass the interview. So if I look back at my education, you know, I did 5 years of undergraduate education, and that alone is not sufficient to be able to get through the interview. I had to do those hundreds of interview questions in my dorm room and practice to be able to make it through. So the same thing, if you take a training from Mosul Space or Recoded, you have to rely on your skills beyond what those trainings give you. Those trainings give you the foundation and the framework to advance yourself on your own, and it's going to be up to your own self-learning to get further. I don't have a CS degree, but if I took courses on some learning platform, can I still get an intern or a job? Yeah, so a degree is not always required. I think for some positions and for also other reasons beyond qualification, like immigration requirements, sometimes a degree is required, depending on the job and the company and so on. I have some coworkers who don't have a CS degree and they work at Facebook. There are people who don't even have a college degree and work at Facebook. So I think it's possible, but sometimes it becomes challenging, like I said, because, for example, if you want to get a visa for some country, they might need you to have a certain level of education to give you that visa for the job. Even if you might be good enough to the job without the college degree, but some immigration rules or visa rules require. So you have to pay attention to that and to see what does the actual job qualification say. For different reasons, they might have certain university requirements. Anything to share on non-engineering jobs? I don't know too much on non-engineering jobs, so I shouldn't talk about them because I'm not very familiar with those jobs or the process for them. Can we do phone screening interviews and then relocate if we get accepted? Yes. So usually that's exactly how it happens, is that you do the screening interview over the phone, and then once you're accepted, then you would have the opportunity to relocate. So that's how it works. How many hours you spend coding a day for Facebook? It depends. It varies. My hours of work are very irregular and inconsistent. So I don't have a straightforward answer to this. There are times when I go for an entire month without coding because we're working in planning and working on preparing and designing things more than coding them. So it depends on where we're at and in the phase of the project we're working on. Do you negotiate the salary? I think there is a small room for negotiation, but usually it's not very, very large. But I think you should research this. I don't actually know too much about salaries or negotiations. You should see on the internet what people say about it. Do you recommend learning a language, Dart? I don't know what Dart is. I haven't heard it. Do you recommend solving problems on LeetCode? Yes, do it. Do a lot of them. Like I said, when you're practicing for interview, try to solve a lot of these problems. Try to solve hundreds of problems if you can. And the way you would do it is going on any of these websites, LeetCode or Caddis or Code Wars or HackerRank or any of these other platforms that are offering coding challenges. And I think any of them is just fine. You can look at problems by difficulty. I encourage you, if you're trying to prepare for a Facebook interview or similar interview, I encourage you to look at problems in the middle range. So don't find the easiest problems and don't find the hardest problems. Hard problems on LeetCode or HackerRank are going to be too hard to come in an interview. The range of difficulty is probably going to be things that are hard from the easy problems and things that are easy from the hard problems, and that range in the middle. So try to see that, try to focus on that range when you're solving problems. But of course, if you're new, you're probably going to start solving easy problems and slowly working your way up. But don't try to kill yourself solving the hardest problems on HackerRank or LeetCode. It's not going to be necessary. Okay, how to take opportunities out there to work at Facebook? I don't really understand this question. How we get those opportunities in the first time? I think, like I was saying, if you go back to the slides, to get a job at Facebook, you have to think about the steps of the process. And first, getting yourself ready with a good resume, and then finding yourself an opportunity that gets you an interview. And once you're in the interview process, then you can follow the tips we shared about preparing for the interview and how to practice for the interview. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the things I talked about today are not just about Facebook. So we did say a lot of it, Facebook this, Facebook that, but it's not just Facebook that follows this process, or these tips that we discussed are not only relevant or applicable to Facebook. So for the most part, they will be transferable. Now, there are some things that are only relevant or specific to Facebook. For example, it might be that choosing your most comfortable programming language in the interview is not an option in some other interviews. So that's a Facebook philosophy that you may not find in every other company. So make sure you also apply context and understanding to the position you're and understand the requirements directly from the company as well. Okay, Shelly, how are we doing? Should we open up the mics and see if people want to ask questions with mics?
Yeah, I think Ahmed Safa was interested in speaking.
Yeah, he's had his hands up for a while.
Greetings. I don't know if you guys really hearing me.
We can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm Ahmed from Kurdistan region, and I would like to thank you for making this happen. So I want to make sure to give the opportunities to my fellow participants too. So my question is, even though you actually explained some part of my question, but does like GPA really matters, like in Facebook, or like having a degree in a specific university, like make it like better to get a job at Facebook, give you a bigger chance?
Yeah, I think I for the GPA, I think the GPA does matter to a certain degree. I don't know how much, because I'm not part of the process where we look at the resumes. I'm involved in the process later when I'm doing the interview, and I'm evaluating candidates during the interview, not before that. But I think to a degree the GPA does matter, because the recruiters, they ask you to put it, so they must care about it to a degree. I don't think it means that it's super important. And if you leave it out, it probably doesn't mean you're guaranteed to not get the interview. So I think if it's good, include it. If you don't feel like you're proud of it, you can leave it out. And it probably doesn't hurt you all that much. It just probably helps you stand out if you include it, and it's a good GPA. And the question about certain universities or college degrees, like I said, I think in some cases the college degree is required for different reasons. So read the job requirements and see what they say. In terms of university, I think it's just kind of a natural state of the world where being from a certain university gives you an advantage. So if you're in a university in the US, you have Facebook coming to your university every season and recruiting directly. That gives you an advantage. If you're in a university in Baghdad, probably you have less of an advantage. So I think that's just a state of the inequality in the world, but it doesn't mean it's impossible, right? So your ability to participate in these things can vary based on or the privilege you have to access these things can vary, but I don't think it means it's impossible for you if you come from Iraq. It just means it's harder. and you have to work harder to get there. But that's the case with everything. Iraqis have to work harder always. So we can take one more
Yeah.
question, actually, and I'll share some closing thoughts on this very same topic.
Arjan?
So I'm a senior IT now, and I know that I know nothing. So how can I know the basics because we took them in university. I've never went into something in IT because I never knew what's the best for me. So what do you recommend as coding to learn more and improve? Because I'm stuck there.
Yeah. So you want to get better at coding?
Yeah, and I would love to know what language is better for me to learn, like which one is like general more
Yeah.
general. Okay, I'm sorry,
So
my English is bad.
no, your English is good. It's great. Thanks for the question. And I think I was trying to answer this question earlier when I was saying, there isn't one programming language that's better to learn than others. I think there are so many languages and there's a huge variety. And what's more important is to try to find something you're passionate about than trying to find the right programming language. So if you're passionate about web development, then that's probably a better thing to pursue.
Okay, excuse me. I do not know what I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
So I would learn anything if it's hard enough because I love hard stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I think in that case, then you probably want to explore and kind of like look around, maybe join Mosul Space, or where are you in Mosul, or where are you based?
I'm in Erbil.
Okay. I think in Erbil you can probably go to Recoded House, or
I do go there.
Okay. And I would that's where I would start, is I would try to enter the community and explore web development, explore mobile development,
My
explore.
friends recommended WordPress for me, but I don't think I'm into like too much web development. I'm more into like applications and the coding stuff, real coding. Like I do love C++, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Then I think you know that WordPress is not going to be interesting for you because it's probably not
It's
aligned
kind
with.
of easy.
Yeah, it's too easy for if you're trying to do more complex
There are
coding.
stuff that the easier they are, the more you don't understand. So,
Right.
yeah.
And if you wanna stay connected and talk more outside of this conversation, I'm happy to chat with you more and learn about
I
your.
did send you a message and we will talk, inshallah.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay. Thank you so
Um,
much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for joining and staying 2 hours. Holy crap, we've been here for 2 hours. So I think should we take one more question, or should we just end here? I want to share some final thoughts. If somebody has a burning question, wants to ask it with the mic, the floor is yours. Or I can look at questions from.
I think this question, if you weren't to get hired at Facebook, where would you see yourself today?
Yeah, I saw this question and I'm kind of avoiding it because it's just such a complex philosophical question that I don't know. It's so hard to think about alternative realities or what would life look like. I hope actually I think about, if I lose my job at Facebook, where would I go? Or if I leave Facebook today, where would I go working? And this is by no means trying to suck up to Recoded because they're here, but I think I would join Recoded probably. And I think about that a lot. And my brother is now with Recoded, and I look at him and like, all right, I'm maybe getting ready to take that move too. So I think what they're doing in Iraq is great, and it's perfectly what I dream of working on and focusing on more. So that's where I think I would go. Okay, so let's. I want to share this one last thought before we close out. It's a quote. Trying to switch my screen. Some of you guys may have heard this before. It says, the quote says, "There are better starters than me, but I'm a strong finisher." Do you know who said this? Anybody knows? See if the comments. Yeah, Usain Bolt. That's right. So this is a quote by Usain Bolt. He's talking probably about running and how, you know, Usain Bolt is the fastest runner in the world, fastest man alive, and he's probably talking about running here and saying how, you know, he doesn't always have the best beginning to his race, but he wins the race by finishing strong, and that's his strength, and that's what makes him stand out, and what makes him better than everybody else. But I think there's a metaphor for life here too, and there's meaning, or there's an opportunity to think about more than just running in this quote. And I think about generally about where we are in our lives and where we start. You know, we have here now, what, 70 people, almost 55 people in this conversation now listening, and each of us comes from a different beginning, from a different background. Some of us are in different parts of the world as well. And where we are, that determines our privilege. And we kind of touched on this. We talked about universities and how if you're from a certain university or you go to a certain school, you have certain advantages or privileges. And those are our beginnings. You know, the families we grew up with, or the schools we attended, or the wealth we had that we started out with. And that determines our beginning. And we will sometimes be ahead or behind in the way we start. But our beginning doesn't need to determine how we finish. And I think about this a lot, and especially for people like us, we're from Iraq, and just by being from Iraq, we're automatically behind with the rest of the world, and we have a disadvantage just by being in Iraq. That's undeniable. But that disadvantage does not mean that we don't finish at the front. It does not mean that we have to stay behind for the rest of our lives. And I used to think a lot about this too for myself. I think, oh, I'm Iraqi. I don't get to work at Facebook. I don't get to apply for the big companies, or have big dreams, or you know, do the projects that I want to do, or have the life that I want to have, because I'm limited in what I can do as an Iraqi. But with life, and you know, as when I think about this quote, and thinking about the fastest man alive saying that he doesn't have the best beginnings in his races, and there are people who start ahead of him or better than him, but what makes him better than everybody else is in how he finishes. And I think it's inspiring to think about that, and how we can learn from Usain Bolt and making finding our way to finish strong and to finish first, just like he does, and not letting our beginnings hold us back. So this is my my closing speech. Thank you everybody for staying this late. I know it's past midnight now, so I appreciate you sticking around. Hopefully this was worth your while, and hopefully you learned something interesting today. Please stay in touch. If you caught my contact information, I'll share it again here. Again, if you add me on Facebook, please message me and introduce yourself so I know who you are. I would love to stay in touch with you, like I said. And yeah, closing out on this note. I don't know if Saleh or Shelly or somebody wants to say something, some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Murtadha. And to everyone who has stayed until 12:15, thank you for joining us. And we will have more similar sessions. Make sure you're following Recoded and Mosul Space on Facebook. And we should follow up with an email as well in the next day or two. So thank you again, Murtadha. Thank you, Mosul Space, and to the rest of the Recoded as well. And thank you to all of you for joining. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And Murtadha, I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.